Okay, welcome to Galactic Shaman Astrologers Community Chat. And we have a topic that is the most important topic that I find in astrology, which is the shadow work. So what's interesting from my experience as an astrologer is generally people first come to me and they want to know how to make money. They want to know about their love life. They want to know what to do with their children. And eventually after all that, I say, okay, let's get into your wound and your shadow. And then we'll know what your mission is here on the planet. And once you get into the wound and the shadow, then you can see what's arising around the partnership, around the children, around the work. And that is my experience, of course, also. So when I studied with Demetra, both Claude and I have very challenging charts. I have Persephone and Proserpina in the first house, and I had a very wounded childhood. And that wound created my shadow self, who is the fiendess. And I had to know my wound and my shadow in order to basically not be taking down buildings. Because if you've heard my conversations with this group before, when I'm upset, I can cause tornadoes, lightning storms, like really incredible energy moves around me. So it's important to know what the shadow is because it can magnetize more and more energy toward you, and you can pull that shadow right into reality. So I'm going to give some examples of the shadow on a nationwide level, and we'll use the United States because that's what I know the best. I'm going to give an example of the shadow in the signs, and we will use Cancer because the North Node is in Cancer. And then I'm going to give an example of the shadow with a planet in the signs. The other thing I want to say is that astrology is about making what is unconscious in your life more conscious. That's what astrology is. So looking into the chart, you will have many opportunities when Pluto, for instance, comes across one of your personal planets. You'll get to experience the underworld and the abyss. When you have your first Saturn return at age 29, you'll hit the first wound/shadow work. When you have the Uranus opposition at age 41 to 43 years old, you might want to split, leave town, get out of here. This is too painful. I'm not doing this. I'm leaving. Okay, so that often happens at 41, 42, 43 years old when you have not really accepted your shadow. And then the Chiron return, which I'm doing right now, happens when you're 49 and 50. And you get another like stab into that wound and a look at the shadow. And then when you're 58 years old, you'll have another Saturn return. Now, by that point, hopefully you've done most of your shadow and wound work, but astrology is like, let's revisit the wound. Let's look at the shadow again. Let's revisit the wound. Let's look at the shadow again. So I'm going to start with the United States because the United States is going into the entrainment for the Pluto return. So the Pluto position that we understand, if our history is correct, which I also doubt completely that any of our historical records are correct, but the Pluto return for the United States and for France is coming within the next couple of years. When Pluto returns to its natal position, the depth of the abyss, the underworld, all the undigested material, sheer terror of everything that has not been dealt with can come up. So let's just look at the example of some clients say to me, is the wound the shadow? Is the wound different from the shadow? Does the wound create the shadow? So let's just look at the example of a country. So if we say the wound of the United States that we know of started when we had the complete decimation of the population that was here that was an ecology-based, living in harmony to the best of their ability with nature, native population. So the wound was, we're going to destroy millions of people, millions and millions of people in the United States, which was the native population. So then the shadow, okay, that will always come from that wound is a country that's based on ecocide and genocide. And so then the shadow becomes the perpetrator of the wound. Hear this very carefully, okay? First, in everyone's chart, including the United States, there's a wound. The wound was the killing of the native population. And then the shadow material comes from that wound. Now we have a country that pretends to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, but we have, in fact, the shadow of ecocide, the destruction of natural resources, and genocide. So the United States, in its July 4th celebration, always sings a song about how the bomb shells finally stopped blasting and our flag was still there. But anyone that has been following the United States knows that the United States is still blasting those bombshells just about everywhere. And now the bombshells are called something else, like terrorism in Afghanistan. And then in Afghanistan, in fact, what we did was take over the poppy field so that we could supply our entire population with opiates. So you can be a very low income person and get as many free opiates as you want. So then the wound again, like going out and decimating other countries, becomes the shadow, because now we're doing a genocide to our own population by providing opiates to everybody, virtually free. Okay. And here in the Upper Valley, we have one of the worst opiate problems, allegedly, in the United States, because Dartmouth Hospital is handing them out right and left. So you can see how the wound becomes the shadow. And then the polarity of that is, of course, that we live in the free, like most enlightened country in the world. If you don't know what the shadow is, are you creating more of the shadow by not talking about it, by not making it conscious, by not having a look at it, by not being able to say this in public? That's my contention, is if we don't say it. And I'm like the shadow priestess, because you can see I am like the shadow priestess. If you look at my posts on Facebook, I'm like pushing everyone's buttons that I can all the time. So for me, it's very important to look at the shadow, or else it gets bigger and bigger, and there's more ecocide and there's more genocide, which is the wound of this country. Okay, so should we stop there? Does anyone want to jump in right now, or should I keep going with the signs? Okay, good. So let's just keep going, because then we can talk about personal experience. That was just an example of how to figure out like the wound in the shadow of your own country. What is it? Then there's this book that I mentioned in the videos at galacticshamanastrologers.net. Now, in my first series of videos, I did not use this book because I was trying to upgrade all of the planets to 5D. And my negligence there was I was trying to be very positive about everything and all of the planets. And then I realized that that was totally avoiding those scariest aspects of ourselves, that then was creating those scarier aspects in the astrology, because nobody wanted to look at the darkness of the abyss with Saturn and Pluto coming together. But let's look at Cancer, as the North Node and the Sun are in Cancer right now. And if you use this kind of book, okay, which is the keywords for astrology, if you use this kind of book, it will give you the strength and it will give you the problem area. And you can start to figure out what the shadow is in your own chart. So the strength that we know, I don't even need to read this, from Cancer is a mother who is loving and tender. She's nurturing. She loves her children with all her being. She's emotionally sensitive to them. She's there every moment of the day. She's like the perfect stay-at-home mom. She's supportive to everyone in the family. Now, the wound, I would say, in that is that she's a doormat. Everybody's walking all over her energetically. So listen again. First, you figure out the wound. She's selflessly serving everyone. She's a martyr. And she's actually giving because she wants to get some attention. And that's actually a trauma. She's giving and giving and giving to actually get attention for what a good mother she is. Okay? Now, what's the shadow? The shadow is children are a prescription for my unhappiness. Children drive me nuts. They all want something. Their noses are running. I've got to get dinner. I have no time for myself. And the shadow becomes a woman who hates her children. Now, when I studied with Barry Long, who I think was like the most fabulous guru for the West, if there was one, he would always say those things like, children are a prescription for unhappiness. Is that true or is that not true? And he would make us so uncomfortable that we would have to look into that shadow. So the best thing that you can do with your shadow is to be terribly uncomfortable and then draw it closer and say, is that true? Yeah, actually, a lot of the time my children are a huge pain in the butt and cause me much, much suffering and are a prescription for my unhappiness. It's true. And so then what you do is you friend that shadow part. You make friends with her. You see that perpetrator who you don't want to be, and you pull her closer and you dance with her. And sometimes you even say that out loud and maybe add humor to that. Like, gosh, the kids really are a prescription for my unhappiness. I'm totally tied to the house and they're dropping cornflakes all over the floor that are sticky and wet. And now I have to mop the floor. It's honest to dance with the shadow. Okay? You see this? Does anyone want to jump in here now that I've described the sign, the wound in the sign, and then the shadow that comes out of that sign? Okay, so if you have planets in Cancer, or your ascendant is in Cancer, your sun is in Cancer, your moon is in Cancer, something like that, the first assessment would be, oh, the bright side of me, the light side of me is I'm a good mother and I really love my children. I do, I love my children. I couldn't exist without my children. They make me so happy. The wound is, actually, I'm a doormat. I have no energy and I'm exhausted. The shadow is, the children are a prescription for my unhappiness. And then you pull that closer, or the clients are a prescription for my unhappiness, or whatever it is that's appearing in your life. And then you pull that closer and you articulate, you name that shadow stuff and you dance with her. You welcome her instead of pushing her away, because the more we push her away, the more the children are, in fact, your prescription for unhappiness. The more the children are, in fact, creating that dark mother complex of, hatred towards your children and hatred towards the fact that you have to clean up the Cheerios on the floor. Okay? That's when the shadow starts to take over, is when we don't dance with her. And then what happens is there's no humor in the life. I told my children again and again, they were a prescription for my unhappiness. Just so you know. And as far as I can tell, they came out fine. But in our culture, to say that to your children is like the ultimate taboo. Don't say that to your children. That's another place where you know the shadow's at work. If you can't say it, the shadow is definitely controlling your life. Because that's a taboo. Don't say that. Don't say that children are a prescription for unhappiness. Okay, are people following me? This is my process. It's really clear to me because I do this every day. Does anyone want to jump in here and say something?
Yeah. I have Chiron in Cancer, and Cancer for me is the house of publics, role, career. And what you're saying is, I can relate to it in terms of working with clients and working in any job that I do. I want to give, and I really want to give, but I often end up overgiving and then getting burnt out and then needing to leave because I despise it. And then that pushing away that you were saying is really relevant, because it's like you say, this is bad for me because I haven't integrated my shadow here, that opportunity, that mirror is mirroring to me through those people and those things. So I find that, like, that choice presently of choosing to integrate that is a struggle. Like, every day I decide, no, like, I'm here and I'm going to do this, because it's really tempting to want to escape from it, isn't it? It's just like, it's not like all happy and light. Yeah.
Yeah, Emmeline. So if you have Chiron in Cancer in the house of community, is that what you're saying? Or career? Career. Okay. So in career, to be honest with the shadow, to dance with the shadow, Emmeline would say, my career is a prescription for my unhappiness. My giving and giving and giving at my job is also a prescription for my unhappiness. And hold that close, dance with that. At the same time, dance with the other aspect. I love giving. I love talking to people. I love helping people out. If we can hold them both the wound or the shadow and the light aspect, then we have come out of duality, which is, last week we were talking about spiritual bypassing and only saying positive things and calling everybody the beloved light emissary. If you can hold them both and say, you know, this is truly slavery. I do feel like I am nothing but a paycheck, and I would just rather quit this job right now. That's the wound in there. And the shadow is, it is my prescription for unhappiness, endlessly going to job, and then I'm coming home and the only thing I'm happy about is my dinner. So it's like being able to dance with them both, you see, and saying, I love to see people. I love to help them get their needs met. And that's when you're dancing with them both. And you're not fully a doormat, because you're holding the shadow firmly, going, yeah, it really is absolutely irrelevant that I work from 9 to 5. See, those are the kind of taboos that I'm talking about. Like, nobody dare say that. And yet that's what we need to say, so that our collective is not living and manifesting the shadow all the time. Anybody want to say anything there?
I can join in on that one. And just comment appreciation for that phrase of X is a prescription for my unhappiness, and be open to that. I've also enjoyed, holding that tension then, and you say, all right, maybe that's true. And what's the opposite of that? And playing into that duality then. And can you hold both things as true and then love both aspects? Right. And that then starts to feel like integration. And that starts to feel like a good start at self-acceptance and self-love, to be able to not fragment or disconnect or cut off from what's uncomfortable.
Yeah, now we're going. Now I can feel it. This is the conversation that is like so difficult to have, because it's like fully integrating all the parts of us. Do you hear what Grant is saying? He's saying you could use that prescription for unhappiness for just about anything in your life, and that would be the shadow that you're dancing with. You're pulling it closer. You're holding that part of you. And we as a society, particularly in the United States, want to pretend that we are this fabulous free country, when in fact we may not be. We may be the prescription of unhappiness for much of the world, in fact, and ourselves. So you can see how that might work. And the light side of the United States is that we do have a lot of opportunities here. And there is a lot of fabulous multicultural experiences that we are a melting pot in a way. So that's the light side of that. Do other people want to talk, or should I jump right into Saturn and the signs? Go ahead, Laura.
So I have Black Moon Lilith in Cancer. And I have it in the 8th house. And I'm also currently, like you, Lolita, going through my Chiron return. And, the things I've sort of pulled out for myself, and my Chiron return is happening in the 5th house. So, looking at the shadow of what comes up for me is being able, number one, to express myself and my needs. Black Moon Lilith comes along and it says, I don't need others. I can take care of this myself. I have birthed and rebirthed and done everything. And I am, there's that sort of dark side of having to do this over and over again. And you're also helping others do it. I've taken a lot of people through death processes, both animals and humans. But at the same time, my own needs, I'll set them aside. So my shadow is like, no, I've got this. I know how to do this. And one of the things that Chiron has brought in relationship to Black Moon Lilith in Cancer is where my needs are not being met, where I'm not allowing myself and communicating, because I also have Mercury in the 1st house in Sagittarius. So it's like these 3 pieces go hand in hand with, how do I express what I need? And how do I not make everyone else wrong for not giving me what I need? Because as a child, that was the thing. I was really good at meeting everybody else's needs because I was psychically in tune with what was going on around me, but I would be very wounded when others couldn't feel what I needed from them. So, I just learned to provide for myself over and over and over again. And that shadow work, like you'd said, you've taken, had things happen throughout my life in different periods, but the one that I'm really met with right now is letting that in, like allowing myself to have my needs met and put that, first, and sort of almost be selfish, and in ways that I never really thought about before. I mean, people talk about selfishness, they talk about what's important, but really being able to say, no, that doesn't work for me. This is what I need. And this is what I need as I am birthing a new self. This is what I need sexually, this is what I need romantically, this is what I need, you know, as spiritually, emotionally, and not setting aside any part of that and sort of pulling it all towards me. So that's my experience, and I'm sure you could even elaborate more, because just knowing the pieces of how those interact with the chart, but that's how I see it with Cancer for me and what's coming up.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So we've had Chiron in Cancer and Black Moon Lilith in Cancer. So Black Moon Lilith is like the great cosmic mother of providing everyone else's needs. That's really interesting. So Cancer and the transits of the North Node and the Sun have been making an opposition to Saturn, which when I make the video about the eclipse coming up, we'll get to hear more of that. But Saturn is like, lay down the law, folks. Like, make sure that your needs are being accounted for and that you have boundaries for people not walking all over you. So that's what Saturn's doing in Capricorn, where it's a domicile lord. It's going, but remember that you have to have your sovereignty and not be a doormat for everybody else, because they don't know what you need. They don't know what your energetic needs are. So I think Saturn has been doing a fabulous job of helping Cancer to not be this, I'm a nice person. Because, you know, I had this fabulous client this week telling me the stories that her mother told her, which was, be a nice girl so you can get married. Say nice things so people will like you. That's the ultimate Cancer mother, light and bright side of, you shitty child, what are you doing? Messing up your dirty shoes in the house again. I mean, and unfortunately, my moon's in Capricorn, so I actually said that, you know. I don't have any planets in Cancer. So if for me, I'm like, how can y'all be such doormats? Like, and you know, fortunately or unfortunately, that's part of my shadow stuff too, is like, gosh, the fiendess mother that I am. Oh my gosh, I'm such a fiendess. But the kids came pretty straight, you know, they came out like saying exactly how it is for them too. Because I didn't tell them to be nice. I didn't tell them to try and get a good husband. I told them, don't ever get married. I was like the opposite of Cancer. I was like, please don't have children. They're a prescription for your unhappiness, right? I say virtually every taboo that there is because I'm the shadow queen. I know, I'm the fiendess. But now, does anyone want to talk more about the shadow archetypes and the signs of Cancer? Okay, so now I'm going to go to Saturn, which if you use this book, Saturn represents your greatest fear, which is a really interesting way of looking at it. Because Saturn will give you kind of the father shadow image in the chart, whereas Cancer can kind of give you the mother shadow image in the chart. And people have asked me, can you have more than one shadow? I was like, yeah, I have multiple personalities going. Yeah, lots of them. Can you have more than one wound? Oh yeah, the list is long. So there's a masculine and a feminine shadow for sure. And I told folks that I would try to do Saturn. Well, I know what it is, but anyways, it's in this book. So let's look at Saturn and Scorpio, which is one of the hardest ones. And then I'm also going to actually do Saturn and Pisces so you can see the difference. Scorpio's content is sexual, occult, hidden, taboo, esoteric type of things that nobody else wants to talk about. So when Saturn's there, in the 1950s, the first time that I really have clients having Saturn and Scorpio, we saw Playboy magazine hit the stands. So Playboy magazine was promoted right after World War II resolved, and the men came home, and they were given a certain amount of entertainment during the war, but then when they came home, they all were asked to join the Playboy clubs, and they had Playboy magazine, and they went to the clubs, but mom had to be like the good mom at home. So that was the first introduction of sexual mania, sexual occult collection of topics that are taboo. Scary, dark fathers who are actually perpetrating towards young, attractive women. So Saturn and Scorpio, if you have that in your chart, the masculine shadow is like a scary sex guy who might even use violence and tactics against you to get you to do his sexual manias. Okay. So then we had that again 30 years later. 30 years later, in the 1980s, this is when porn started really going nuts. And I remember, because I was a child in the 1980s, that men, the energy of men, again, there was that like, you know, trying to get their sexual needs met in scary, dark ways. And a lot of children who were growing up at that time were perpetrated against by the energy of Saturn and Scorpio. So the dark, scary father who's waiting for the little girl to go upstairs while she's changing her clothes and peering in, or screaming at her when he actually wants to rape her. This is some of that wound and shadow stuff with Saturn and Scorpio that nobody wants to talk about. But when it's in your chart, what can happen is you will magnetize that if you cannot articulate it, if you're not able to name it. And I'm not saying, you know, that was bad necessarily. I'm saying dance with that shadow, get to know that archetype, make sure that you can name it if it's a wound, make sure you can name it if it's the shadow that you're attracting, and if it's the part of the masculine that is your shadow that Saturn scares you the most, that you absolutely find disgusting and abhor, that's likely the shadow. Does anyone want to talk about that very hot topic?
Yeah, I can jump in. I have Saturn in Scorpio. It's in the 12th house as well. So yeah, very difficult father relationship, and it just sums up my relationship with the masculine, really, including the masculine side of myself. It just feels like it's completely in the dark. You know, I don't. It's really hard to connect to it at all, in comparison to being able to find my feminine shadow. It's like I can feel her. I know where she's at. I know she's Kali. I know her patterns, and I know and I love her. But it's like blank with this. It's so 12th house. It's so 12th house, and it's also so Scorpio, because my Chiron is also in the house of other, and they seem to be doing a weird thing. But where I struggle most with it is owning this shadow, because this kind of behavior, like you said, I just find it disgusting. And where I can own my feminine, I guess that's the difference between are there two types of shadow? I don't know. There are shadows that I can own, and I know I live and I even love, but I'm like, what the hell is that? It's like I I just can't, I don't condone it. I don't feel it as being part of me. I don't know, I just feel that's the embodiment of my relationship with that aspect.
Yeah, Flor. So this is giving us some more information that the 12th house is deeply hidden.
Mm.
So if you have planets in the 12th house, particularly if the father, the masculine shadow, is in the 12th house, that is really hard to access because we pushed it as far away from us as we can. So for instance, anyone can look at their 12th house in any planet and say, ooh, that must be a hidden part of me that I need to make conscious. So just there, everyone can look at their 12th house and say, what's in that 12th house? That is deeply hidden from me. And that is often the thing I abhor. Like that is something I don't want to admit to. So I have my South Node in the 12th house conjunct Washington, which is our country's capital. So what do I hate the most? Right? The government of the United States, because it's in my 12th house. Okay? So I'm not saying that you're going to like your shadow, because that also is a prescription for your unhappiness. But I want you to be able to articulate it, to name it, to sit with it, to know what it is. Otherwise, we attract it. Then that person shows right up and sends a letter, and you, this group knows, got a letter from Washington this week. Claude is permanently quarantined in the United States. I'm going, my shadow just came in the mail from the Washington Department of Security, blobbity. Okay, so I attracted my shadow. So I dance with that shadow now. So that was the thing that was hidden from me, that scares me the most, that is absolutely disgusting. I hate it. There's nothing wrong with those words. I probably was George Washington in a previous life. I'm the perpetrator of this entire country. I have no idea. Yeah, you know what I mean? So that's it too. What else? Flora, you want to say anything else there?
Yeah, I guess just with the quality of Scorpio, that sexual kind of perpetrator being, I have such resistance. I don't want to dance with it. I don't want to do it. And so then what do I,
Yeah. So I'll let other people jump in too, because I want us to talk to this question here. So say that you love your feminine, you love the fiendess, you have swords, you can cut heads off, you're ready to go. But it's really hard to embrace the thing that you most dislike. That's so disgusting. And what I had told Flora in a private conversation was that when we did our shamanic training, we went out and collected everything that was the most defiling, disgusting thing possible. And we made art with it, and we kept it next to our bed. And we looked at that disgusting thing, like slugs on rotting flesh on a deer pelvis. And we smelled it, you know, and it was next to my bed. Now, my shamanic training is not like a lot of the power of positivity stuff that's going on now. My shamanic thing was like, all right, do a meditation on completely dismembering yourself. Let your guts fall out. That was my shamanic training. Like, what scares you the most? Bring it closer. Any other advice for Flora on this one?
If the conversation I was having the other day with someone was about a similar thing, kind of that karmic thing of I was maybe the perpetrator of this blah de blah, but now I feel the opposite of it because I'm so uninterested in it and like repelled, you know, and I was feeling quite like like emotive about it, obviously, and we were saying like it's kind of like we're all, for me, I feel like we're all working through the same wounds in to different ways and different degrees of it, of course, but it feels like if one person is at a certain point, then that's a mirror of possibly a collective thing, because it's like you feel the reality of how people engage with a certain shadow, and you can't just, it's a slow process because people in general are just, unaware of it, or just, unconscious to it. Or how can we become more conscious?
Yeah, I want to just point out that we also discussed a little bit, Jessica had put up a post this week and I asked Demetra this question, just because you were raped as a child does not mean that you were a rapist. Okay, so I want to be really clear about this. You can hold the shadow close, but that's not necessarily you. Okay? I mean, I play around with it to see, would I be okay if that was me? If I was the George Washington or Washington, D.C. or whatever it is on my South Node in the 12th house, would it be okay if I was the perpetrator of genocide? Would it be okay if I was the perpetrator of ecocide, of the destruction of plants and animals? Because obviously the light and bright side of me is that I preserve nature and that I love nature. It doesn't mean necessarily that I was the perpetrator of genocide and ecocide, but I still will hold that whole shadow, that whole wound, as if it is mine. And that's that radical forgiveness stuff. That doesn't mean that I condone it either. Because I can hold it doesn't mean I condone pedophilia or ecocide or genocide. But there's a difference between being able to hold it, that I am the perpetrator of that, and not thinking, oh, I was therefore a rapist, so then I deserve to be raped a bunch of time when I was a child, or beaten, or whatever it was, or molested. Demetra, when I asked her about this, I asked her, why is it that I had this horrible childhood? Like, basically, like, did I deserve that? And I don't think that it correlates like that. I don't think that it karmically assumes that therefore I created that in some other lifetime and so I deserve it now. I don't think that's true at all. So don't identify as if you deserve it or that you condone it to be able to dance with the shadow. Do you hear that? Anybody want to jump in there?
Yeah, I agree with you, Lolita. It's not about deserving. Part of it is acceptance of, that we decided to take on. I mean, we created this blueprint, right? So we created these configurations, and it's there are places in there that these experiences were drawn into us, but it's not necessarily out of deserving or not deserving or karmic load or any of those things. Some of it might be karmic load, but a lot of it is just the experience. But I also think that plays into a much larger picture of once we came through the birth canal and what we were approached with in terms of the reality of the matrix and everything else that goes into that. But going back to the 12th house, and sort of that piece, and I don't know if we've talked about it here or that I've even talked to you, but, you know, so much is hidden there. And that to me plays more into what we carried forward with us that wants to be worked out maybe in this lifetime, as opposed to the entire chart being something that we deserve. You know, to me, those hidden pieces are things that we might not have reconciled previously. I mean, I have Venus in the 12th house in Scorpio. So Flora, I have the opposite problem. I mean, you've got Saturn sitting there in Scorpio. I've got Venus sitting there in Scorpio, which sort of like what parts of me weren't standing in the gloriousness of being feminine, and sort of some of the destructive patterning that came out of being feminine and what was hidden from me. Like, how did I use my femininity in ways that I didn't want to recognize? And I've had a really, really hard time identifying that, because it's not available until it's available. It's not available until, like Lolita said, we are willing to pull it really close, look at it, dance with it, have it, you know, right in front of us. And those experiences only come from asserting to ourselves that this is where we want to be and what we want to do, and that, you know, this is important to us to get past that. Because once things happen, like I know for myself, when things are repetitive or seem to be on repeat, like experiences keep coming back, I have to go and look for the place in me that something is hidden, because and inevitably it will always come back to either Venus or Neptune, because I have them both in the 12th house. So I know that it's not about deserving, it's just about completing. And you've talked a lot about where we come in and where we are in personal versus, you know, interpersonal versus transpersonal, and, you know, where we place these is part of the work. And to me, that makes more sense than saying, oh, I deserve this from something I did in the past.
Holly or Grant, do you want to talk about this topic, like the 12th house, like what's in your 12th house? What shadow do you know or not know about from the 12th house, or anything like this?
Sure. Yeah, I would have a lot to be able to go on. So many topics to sort of tie back together here. Start with the 12th house for me. That is Leo, and I have my North Node in my 12th house, and that's it. So that collective unconscious of what am I moving to? I'm not quite sure, but I'm working on it. And getting back to Saturn, I have Saturn in my second house of Libra. Finding how much I balance and all the things I do balance or take on, and the ways in which, you know, to pull all the way back to that being the doormat, being that great mother. Cancer is my 11th house with Ceres there, so I sort of stacked experience in that. So that one resonates a lot with me. Then more the need for boundaries, more the need for, you know, maybe part of being here at this time is working on loving in the way that is loving with appropriate boundaries. And then, you know, the way what you were saying with we are not our shadow, right? So we can pull it close, but that doesn't mean we condone or endorse that shadow or the output from that wound, right? So that's, again, another boundary of, okay, that's me, but it's not me. It's me and I love it, but it is, so what I'm moving away from in that way. Lots to mention back with the porn discussion as well. That's a big topic for me. But two, I think there's a bigger pattern there. Personal experience and sort of doing some of my men's group work is just even acknowledging the wound is very difficult for men. A mother wound, father wound, I think it's coming back into vogue a little bit more now. There was a bit of a movement in the late 80s, early 90s on that situation, but it is, that man box of only being able to express anger, or only, not being able to hold fear, not being able to hold injury. The only allowable expression for men is anger, other than happiness and excitement, right? So part of growing out of that and part of embracing that shadow is honoring the wounds, honoring the ways in which we have been hurt, and the ways in which our childhood wasn't the most beautiful, loving experience that we can ever imagine, right? And like, oh yeah, so that really was hard. Some things didn't go as best they could, and there were injuries there. I think I covered them all.
Great, Grant. I'm going to come back to this because I want to get everybody to have an image of their inner little boy in a moment, mostly because there's mostly women on this call. But I want to hear from Holly first. Do you want to talk, hon?
Sure. I think my 12th house always feels very disconnected for me. It's like this source of pain that I can't always really put my finger on. And my 12th house is Taurus, which is that kind of sign of like bursting forth and flowering and abundance. And with Chiron there, it's always this like nagging feeling that I can't really enjoy things. And that also happens to trine my my Venus in the 8th house, which is another one of these like hard to reach places. It's that house of death and transformation. And my Sun is there too, in a slightly bigger orb. So these things are not, these kind of pain points are not well configured to my ascendant. And so it sometimes makes me feel a little bit disconnected from who I am. And so it is this, there are a lot of aspects in my chart to this one point in the 12th house in Taurus. So this deep kind of subconscious wound that is always really hard for me to really put words to it. It also sextiles Jupiter in Cancer. So when I feel that shadow side of Cancer, the kind of the wounded mother thing, and it's almost like Jupiter expands that, like it snowballs, and it ties into that other aspect with the wounding with women, and to my Sun. And actually there's an aspect to Saturn as well. So I have Saturn trine Chiron in the 12th. Saturn's in Virgo in the 4th house for me. So there's this feeling of like constriction when it comes to father matters sometimes, but also it's retrograde Saturn, so it's very internalized, and the criticality of Virgo is like almost magnified inside of me, where I've had to do a lot of work to release a lot of self-judgment, and it's all been this internal process, something that I haven't talked much about, because it's like my inner judge is like right there. That judging aspect of Saturn, and it's like Virgo is a sign that is about the minutia and evaluating things and analyzing things. So my own like inner critic ties right into that subconscious wound. So it's like almost anything that happens will activate, and things, if I go someplace and something stirs something subconscious up in me, it'll go right to that inner critic of what does this have to do with me? What did I do wrong? And I have to like rein myself in and really. So with Taurus in the 12th, that means, my ascendant is Gemini. I have to go back to the facts. I have to leverage the facts, enjoy the moment, and know that I can't let my inner world run the show, and I have to evaluate what's going on and be very conscious of the stories I tell myself. You know, that kind of shamanic aspect of Chiron is a bit of a storyteller. And I've been thinking about this as well from listening to last week's discussion about Neptune, which for me, Neptune is a very storyteller type of planet. And it is that, you know, it's the illusions and what do we tell ourselves. And in my chart, it squares Saturn, and it's opposite my ascendant, and it's currently transiting and square my ascendant and my descendant. And so it's like, what are the illusions of the stories that I am telling people, telling about myself in my head about people, and stopping and saying, you know, kind of like Lolita's line of, you know, what you were saying is, my thing is, what is the story that I'm telling myself, and is it really accurate and true? And am I going down some negative thought spiral because I know I have this planet that can be somewhat of a downer, and at its worst very malefic, in this role of my inner critic. And you know, and it also sextiles things in Scorpio, which is you know, my 6th house. So when I'm out there in the world and having kind of shadow experiences, and I'm like, there are times when I know it funnels all into me, and I know I have to go back and sort it out and be realistic with it and know that it's not on me. Even though that's kind of like my first gut reaction. It's me, it's my fault. What did I do wrong this time? Even though those things may not actually be true. You know, so yeah, so for me, even though I just have one planet in the 12th, you could argue that Chiron is just a planetoid. It ties into everything, and it always makes my shadow feelings easily triggered, I guess is how I would say it.
Thanks, Holly. I think one of our first meetings was about Chiron, and we talked about Chiron being in your 12th house. And I said, look into everyone's environment. Holly is in her cave. She's in her Chiron cave. And so sometimes you just have to look around and say, okay, how is this shadow place, this hidden part of me, presenting in my environment? And then Holly with her Gemini ascendant is speaking like many foreign languages. I hope you all can follow her, but her astrologos is really incredible. I follow her because I know her chart, and I'm going, okay, yes. And her Saturn in Virgo is like that inner critic father who's always going, oh gosh, I wasn't perfect. I'm going to like beat myself up now because it must be my fault. So she's naming 2 of those wound and shadow things that show up for her. Saturn in Virgo is really hard because it's like the continual father figure criticizing you all the time. But it's your inner masculine, you see? And if Holly pushes that away, you know, then she almost needs to push it away to get a look at it because it's always criticizing her. She's got to give it some space from herself. So in that way, Holly's got a really interesting chart. It's so close to her that she's got to push it away to get a look at it, that Saturn in Virgo. Is that true, Holly?
Yeah, and then I also have to like self-monitor, because when I start projecting it outward, I realize, even though I have it has there. I do have like a higher natural tolerance for criticism at times, and I don't always realize that there are other people who can be a little bit more tender, and I have learned to kind of check myself, and that, you know, what I sometimes feel is helpful criticism is not necessarily what someone else is going to find helpful criticism. Because this is my normal state of being, and this is what my inner dialogue is, because it's such a loud and present thing. And you know, this is also my fourth house, so this is my family ancestry, you know, and I can totally see how this developed in me, knowing my family, why I have this very strong inner critic, and I have had to learn to loosen that up a little bit, as much as you can loosen anything with Saturn up. Consciously say, okay, am I being too harsh? Am I being too harsh on my daughter? Because I do have a trine between Saturn and Venus. And am I being too hard on myself? I'm being too hard on my daughter. Where do I need to let go of that Virgo shadow of being snippy, being overly critical, being harsh, not being sensitive to other feelings, you know, and integrate more of my feeling side, which has been a little bit, you know, difficult. You know, but we also be easy on myself. Everybody has their shadow. My shadow is, this is part of my shadow. This is part of my shadow that I can see, is that if I start lashing out and I'm being snippy, something's bothering me, and now I have to go, you know, go in my cave. Here I am in my cave, and understand, try to like feel into what's bothering me, that's showing up in kind of snippy ways. Or the other extreme, I know I can be overly critical, and so then I don't speak at all. And then I hold it in. And for a Gemini ascendant to hold it in is actually really not healthy. It's not healthy for anyone, but for an ascendant sign that is so much about verbal communication, to bite my tongue because I'm afraid I'm going to like hurt someone, and I've had to kind of come to terms that, you know, sometimes people on the other end of that need to hear it. I just have to say it with some kind of grace and just kind of put the slight brakes on a little bit and not lash out. The other part of this that I was thinking is that because I, you know, to bring another astrological twist to this, is where sect is involved. We're talking about the Saturn wounds, but you know, Saturn is a little bit more friendly in a day chart, and I have a day chart, so it is not my more malefic planet. My more malefic planet is Mars. So when my Mars is acting out and I'm saying something impulsively, and I'm flying off the handle and I'm mad, and it's configured to my ascendant, so I'm going to say something that may be a little bit more cutting than I meant, or a little bit more cutting in a judgy way than I meant. And so I have to take a deep breath, know that I'm getting fired up, know that there's something that's triggering me, and now it's tied right to my mouth, kind of, you know, well, my Mars is in Leo, so it's really easy if I get mad, you know, I might say something, and I'm eloquent enough that if I'm really mad and that Mars is like really fired up, I'm going to say something, and later I'm going to feel really bad about it. And then I'm going to go back into that loop where I'm going to self-judge again. You know, but at the other end is, do I bite my tongue and then I repress that Mars bit, and then it stirs around inside of me, and it's like this negative cyclone inside of my body. So yeah, it's been interesting to get to know myself through my chart.
Yeah, so you all hear, this is a Gemini ascendant, and the Gemini ascendant, first of all, needs to speak. You hear how much Holly needs to speak. And what she said was that if she's not doing her ascendant, which is one of my primary things in astrology, if you're not doing your ascendant, then the rest of your planets are suffering in the shadow. So then her Mars starts getting Martian in Leo. So look at that in your own chart too. If you're not able to do your ascendant, then particularly the stuff in the 12th house can be more hidden, more unconscious, more wounded, more shadow, or anywhere in your chart. So do your ascendant, and that's why Libra and ascendant as I am, I'm going to say stuff too often, which Demetra said, say it, say it. Now I want to help everybody figure out their little boy inside. So this is a really interesting one because there's mostly women in here. And it might be hard for you to figure out your masculine shadow altogether. As Flora was speaking about, how do you even figure out your masculine shadow? Start with the wound, then see how the wound developed into something that was going to defend you against the wound. And that's often your shadow. The way I had to figure it out was, and there's multiple personalities inside of me. Basically, I have lots of little boys and little girls expressing in there. But one of the little boys is, I think of what did my birth father, my biological father, look like when he was a child? What did he look like? What is the image that immediately comes to me? And my little boy child inside is impoverished. He's tied to a tree while his parents are at the bar. So the little boy child inside of me is that father image, because that's what I can come up with right now. He's impoverished. He has no money. He's absolutely poverty stricken. And he's tied to a tree. And his parents are both at the bar on the other side of the railroad tracks. So he's abandoned. And that little boy inside of me will come out as a shadow. I'm never going to be impoverished, let me tell you. You hear it? Do you hear it? So the little boy, he's impoverished. He's truly in poverty. And he's tied to a tree. I am never going to be impoverished. And I am going to go anywhere I want to go. I am completely free. And no one will ever tie me to a tree. And my parents, I don't care, because I'm going to be taking care of me. So that's my shadow. But I dance with that shadow. I don't say, oh, Lalita, you're so horrible because you want to live a life of wealth and abundance. Oh, that's a taboo in my family. If you notice, when I'm traveling to Australia or Scotland or Colorado or Kauai, not one family member of mine ever comments, because they all still have that wound of poverty, all of them. And when I was in Australia, I said, why did none of my family members, my cousins, ever say, oh, Lalita, it's so wonderful you're in Australia? And one of my cousins said, I'm jealous of you. So she's still carrying that little boy wound in her, which is her uncle, my father. And her shadow has taken over her world. She does live in poverty. She refuses to have abundance and wealth. Do you see how you find the little boy? And I don't expect to put you all on the spot, but does anyone want to comment? What does your little boy wound look like? That little boy inside?
I'll comment. On first glance, it feels like someone who's been extradited from the community and sort of almost like scapegoated as like the odd one out, and they always have to earn their way back in. and build their own like mountain, and like make their way in the world, and like be like self-sustainable and like successful. But it's all like the striving of like, oh, I need to be seen to fit in. Yeah.
So are you saying your little boy needs to somehow not be an outcast, but somehow prove himself?
Yeah.
What's the shadow there, Emmeline? Tell me.
What it's like make yeah, it's kind of like you feel like you need to re-establish yourself and re-enter into something that you were shunned away from. Yeah, I can see that in my dad, and I can feel that in me. So the shadow, is that like, I'm just trying to figure out, is that not the shadow?
And the shadow may not be completely clear yet. It took me a long time to find out that the taboo, the shadow person in my family was someone who was wealthy. That's a total shadow in my family. You're not allowed to be wealthy.
Oh, I see. So yeah, so the shadow in this case would be like, it would be like, you can't just receive something without earning it. It's the actual just reception of something. It's like when I it's like when I asked my dad for his like support with something, and he just said no, like you have to get it yourself, because he has that wound where he's like, he can't fathom actually receiving that himself. Yeah, and I really relate to that. I really relate to, like, I know that I need to learn this beautiful lesson of receiving, but it's so hard for me because so much of me is like, oh, but I need to make it myself. Yeah. Which is like this Cancer aspect of the mother, of receiving, the feminine, the goddess, which ironically trines my Venus in Scorpio. It's called the Chiron, this like feminine being like, oh, can I? Yeah.
Yeah. So are people following this? Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah. So, I have two examples of it showing up in my life. My father grew up in poverty, and his way out was knowledge and going to school. And he graduated from high school at 16, would hitchhike to college, got 2 degrees, went back to, get became an attorney at 30 years old. It was all about being educated. You had to be educated to get, no way was that woman going to be there. And so for me, that was always pushed on me, that I had to go to school, that I had to earn good grades, that I had to like go to college. And I get to college and I was like, no, I'm not doing this. I don't need to do this. I know this. And I rebelled, and the little masculine boy in me said, no, I'm going to do it. I'm going to prove that I can be successful without the knowledge, without the book and the education. And my father literally like lost his mind over it. I mean, he just was like, how can you do this? How are you going to make it in the world? Like, if you don't have this education, you're not going to be able to do that. So I went off and, I spent 10 years proving him wrong, and went into corporate life and became, one thing after another, finally got to the top position. And when I got there, I was like, well, that was fun. Like, I didn't even do this for me. I did this, to prove something to my father. So I walked away again. And this time when I walked away knowing that I didn't need to be smart, that it wasn't about that kind of intelligence. And then that is when I began the journey of allowing that sort of little boy to not be defined by whether or not I was smart or whether or not I had the right education, the right things. And I was able to say, no, it doesn't matter. And I walked away from my career. Everybody thought I'd lost my mind, including my father, because I spent so much time getting there, but only realizing that that was not really where I was supposed to land. And so the little boy was like, let's go play. And so it became about playing, and it became about, instead of doing, it became about being, and what could I do to just entertain another side of myself. And that's when I decided that I quit my job and I went traveling all around the world for a few years and just took in the experience versus having to learn anything. Like, I did not want to learn one single thing. Like, the rebellion of all of that was like, no, not doing that. And simultaneously in that whole process, my father got very, very sick. And so, and he ended up passing away and transitioning out of this. And when he was days away from transitioning, he looked at me and said, I wish I had figured out what you figured out. And he knew that I was happier than he'd ever been, and that I had done everything different than him, and how much of it he was trying to force upon me was the little boy saying, no, I'm not doing this. So that's my example, just in terms of having, because it really got pushed on me. I mean, there was a lot of pressure, even to go to law school, just do all these things that just wasn't my setup. And my son is in the first house, and my father had a big influence on my entire being. Like, he had a big influence on me and who I was. So that was part of, me reestablishing myself. And when he passed away, it allowed me to to make amends with him in a way that, he saw me for who I was and saw the different choice that I'd made, and that I wasn't going to be that educated daughter. But yet he recognized my intelligence in a completely different way.
Yeah, so are people following how Laura identified the wound that the father had of impoverishment, and then he went through his process of education, and then Laura refused that. She would not do that, but she was going to prove it, which is, I think, actually Laura's kind of shadow side, proving that she could get to the top of the corporate world or whatever. So the shadow side is like saying to the wound, I'm going to show you how big and strong I can be. That's actually the shadow side that we magnetize. And then the resolution is not to push that part away from us, but just to say, okay, yeah, I did that. Okay, yeah, that was true, did that. And now I'm going to be the little boy who's just going to play and have fun and enjoy my life without having to prove it or heal that wound anymore. And then her father said, I wish I had figured that out. And that's how we do the ancestral healing. That's how we make it conscious in the family line. Anybody else want to talk about their inner little boy? I'd love to hear Grant's inner little boy, because he's a big boy.
That's a fun one. Yeah, I did some work on this about a year ago. Deep work on my little boy, and it follows a little bit with what Emmeline was saying in this need of earning love or staying within this pattern, this guideline of expected behavior, right? And you're either in or you're out, and you have to keep earning to stay in type of situation. So if that's the wound for that little boy, then the shadow comes out in some ways I experience projecting that wound onto others. And that's something, and sort of Holly's mentioning too, where this, self-awareness of like, wait, that's not actually you. That's my interpretation or my lens I'm putting on to view this through. So that's been some good growth for me to sort of reconcile with that wounded boy and bring him love. He can be loved while he's crying. He can be loved while he's tantruming, he can be loved through all of that, right? So that's my form of healing that. And then in doing that, I have 2 sons, and so I do that work and talk about it with them, and hopefully help them grow and heal with that knowledge as well, of the wounds of the father don't necessarily have to be the wounds of the sons, of the children. So I think that also is part of what we're here to do, is to help heal that family karma. So yeah, it's another big exciting topic for me that I can really get passionate about.
Yeah, this topic of the wound, the shadow, the inner little boy and the inner little girl is something we could talk about for the next year, every week. And that's why I think at this point, with the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions happening on this next full moon eclipse, it's going to magnetize a full year, actually, because Demetra said the eclipses set a doorway that opens for a full year. So the moon, Saturn, and Pluto are all going to be on the south node of our collective past, with 7 planets retrograde. Like, let's review the wound, the shadow, the scariest abyss of plutonic darkness. And I really encourage everyone to listen to this conversation who's watching on YouTube or Vimeo or on Facebook, and figure these points out for yourself. Anybody else, Fleur or Holly, want to talk about the little boy inside?
Yeah, I'm recognizing this is something I've never considered before, but I can see my father had a very turbulent relationship with his father. The tension was always brewing, and it blew up. We witnessed it a few times, and lots of just complete. As a child, he just got pushed. There was quite a lot of cruelty. I remember him sharing when we were kids that his father shot his dog in front of him, and in lots of ways this dog was his only friend, and all this is kind of still in him, and it's really interesting to look at it ancestrally. And I'm seeing the Saturn in my 12th house, because that shadow of his childhood, it felt for me and my sister growing up like our dad was breathing down our neck all the time. So I can see like the 12th house in that sense, as well as, yeah, let us breathe, just down, right there behind us all the time. Too much where he had nothing. So yeah.
So you're able to see your father's wound and see that created his shadow of you breathing down your neck all the time, kind of being right up there behind you, because his father was not. His father shot his dog. So then that unconscious part in the 12th house that's deeply hidden is this father who's just like on me all the time. And that becomes a shadow then that we might attract in the world, of a partner or a client or anybody who's like, give me some space. Why are you on me all the time? And the shadow would be, that is a really tough one, because it would be like, are you, Fleur, any part of you reacting toward that and then not being completely available to your clients or your children or your life in some way?
Yeah, I mean, my divorce brought a lot of that up, because all of a sudden I had kind of this free time. There was like when I'd been mothering when they were like smaller, and then it's like, so this maiden part of me had come out and started going to gigs and things again, and I found the trying to do, like, having that duality, it was almost easy. It's almost easier to just not do that or go at it a bit gentler, because it's really hard to then come back into you know, mothering, especially being a single mum. Yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so good. This is so, and this is a question we're going to keep asking ourselves all year. What is that little boy inside? Who is that little girl inside? Holly, do you want to finish up? Do you have something to say?
Yeah, I think some of my little boy kind of woundedness comes, and in thinking about my father, he felt, well, one is that criticism. He lived with his grandparents, and they were very like Victorian, you know, like the child should be seen and not heard, and very structured and disciplined. So a little bit has been breaking free of that kind of traditional bit and being a little bit more out there. So it's really hard for me to be public with my, like, this is hard being on YouTube, and I know, no one knows me out there except for my first name, but this is still really hard. This is still something I haven't fully talked to my family about, because this is a little bit too out there for them. So, where he felt a little bit abandoned, he felt very criticized, he never felt like he could really be himself out there. I've somehow internalized that, and I've carried that part of that wound where, it's very much a little, I see my nephew and he's out there swinging sticks and stuff, and I still struggle really to put out my yang energy out there, because I'm like, what, it's probably too much. It's too far out there, too cosmic, and I still stay in some kind of narrow traditional things because I'm still working through it.
Yeah, this is a really great forum for our boundaries, our wounds, our shadows. This is really amazing. And I have said before, I encourage other groups to have Zoom conferences and get into some deep conversations, because where we are at this point is Saturn and Pluto are going to potentially make every intimate encounter press the button of your wound. So even letters in the mail, even bizarre phone calls that come in, it's all going to be like, or earthquakes in your backyard are potentially coming. Financial disasters, as far as I can tell, with the Pluto return to the United States, Pluto in the second house could occur. So we want to just find out what is the scariest stuff, the wound, the shadow, the part of me that I don't want to say publicly, and maybe go there. So I congratulate Holly, you I know in your chart, this is like big to like get on TV, YouTube, Vimeo. There she is telling her personal stuff. So does anyone else have closing remarks? Like I said, we can talk about this for the next year, but why don't we end now and get ready for this eclipse, which according to astro.com said that you could like reach a level of meaninglessness in your life. But I would say that's only if you're not willing to invite the shadow in and dance with her. Then it all seems absolutely meaningless with Pluto and Saturn conjunct a full moon eclipse. So dance with the shadow, and then there will be meaning there. Definitely. Okay, bye-bye, and thank you all.